The sun dipped below the horizon, painting the sky in streaks of amber and crimson. Our car bumped along the winding dirt road, its headlights slicing through the dense forest. Yellowstone National Park sprawled around us, a labyrinth of towering trees, jagged cliffs, and steaming geysers. The air was thick with the piney scent of the wilderness and a whisper of something older. We were 5, me, Sophie, my boyfriend, Eric, our childhood friends, Callie and Nate's younger brother, Liam. This trip had been Eric's idea, a weekend getaway to escape the suffocating grind of city life. His enthusiasm had been contagious, and before long, we were loading up the car with tents, sleeping bags, and enough snacks to feed a small army. By the time we reached our campsite, the twilight had deepened into night. Eric and Nate worked quickly to pitch the tents while Callie and I unloaded the gear. Liam, ever the restless spirit, wandered off with a flashlight, promising to be back before we finished setting up. "Don't go too far," Nate called after him. "I'm just exploring." Liam's voice echoed back, already fading into the dark. By the time the tents were up and the campfire crackling, Liam still hadn't returned. The forest loomed around us, shadows stretching like skeletal fingers in the flickering firelight. "I'll go find him," Nate said, grabbing a flashlight. "I'll come with you," Eric offered, but Nate waved him off. "He's probably just lost track of time. I'll be back in 10. We waited, the minutes dragging by in uneasy silence. Callie fidgeted with the hem of her jacket, her eyes darting toward the trees. Eric stared into the fire, his jaw tight. When 20 minutes passed with no sign of either Nate or Liam, the unease blossomed into something sharper. "We should go look for them," Callie said. Eric nodded, already grabbing his flashlight. "Stay here, Sophie. If they come back, you'll be here to meet them." I didn't like the idea of staying behind, but someone needed to tend the fire. "Be careful," I said, my voice trembling despite my best efforts. Eric and Callie disappeared into the woods, their lights bobbing through the darkness. Alone by the fire, I strained to hear any sound over the crackling flames and the occasional rustle of leaves. The forest seemed to breathe around me, the night air humming with an energy I couldn't quite place. Time dragged on. My phone showed 11:47 p.m. They'd been gone for over an hour. Panic gnawed at the edges of my mind. Should I go after them? Stay put? Then, faintly, I heard it, a low, melodic hum. It wasn't the wind or the creak of trees. It was deliberate, otherworldly, and growing louder. My breath hitched. "Eric? Callie?" I called, but my voice sounded small and fragile. The humming swelled, joined by a chorus of whispers. They didn't come from any direction but seemed to emanate from the forest itself, encircling me like a spectral embrace. And then I saw them. Figures, pale and translucent, drifting between the trees. Their features were blurred, their forms barely more than flickering shapes of light. Some moved with a grace that was almost hypnotic, while others twitched and jerked as if bound by unseen strings. They weren't human. One of them stopped, its head tilting as if sensing my gaze. It turned toward me, and though it had no discernible eyes, I felt its stare burrow into my soul. I stumbled back, my foot catching on a log, and fell hard onto the ground. Pain flared in my wrist, but I barely noticed. The figure glided closer, its shimmering form flickering like a dying flame. I scrambled to my feet, heart pounding as I backed toward the car. The humming grew deafening, a symphony of ancient voices that seemed to vibrate through my very bones. And then, as suddenly as it began, it stopped. The figures vanished, leaving the forest eerily still. "Sophie." I whipped around to see Eric and Callie emerging from the trees, their faces pale and drawn. "We need to leave," Eric said, his voice tight with urgency. "Where are Nate and Liam?" I asked, dread coiling in my gut. "They're gone," Callie whispered, tears streaming down her face. "What do you mean, gone?" Eric grabbed my arm. "We'll explain later. Get in the car. Now." We didn't wait to pack up the tents or extinguish the fire. Eric started the car, the tires skidding as he turned us back toward the dirt road. As we sped away, I glanced out the window and saw them again, standing in the trees. Dozens of them, their ghostly forms glowing faintly in the darkness. watching. Waiting. And deep in the heart of the forest, I could have sworn I heard the faint echo of a laugh. The dirt road unraveled ahead of us, barely illuminated by the car's headlights. The forest pressed close, the trees so thick it felt as though they might close in entirely and swallow us. In the passenger seat, Eric gripped the map with white-knuckled hands, his jaw clenched tight. I sat behind him, my thoughts a tangled mess of fear and confusion. Callie was next to me, staring out the window, her eyes glassy with tears. I reached out to comfort her, but she flinched, her gaze snapping to mine. "They took them," she said, her voice barely a whisper. "They're not coming back." "What do you mean? Who took them?" My voice was shaky, rising with panic. Callie just shook her head, hugging herself tightly. Eric glanced back, his face grim. "We're not stopping until we're out of here. We'll figure it out later." But the road was endless, twisting and turning without any landmarks or signs. The GPS on Eric's phone was useless, the signal had vanished the moment we entered the forest. "Are we even going the right way?" I asked, my voice rising. Eric didn't answer immediately. His silence was answer enough. The tension in the car was suffocating. Every shadow that flitted across the road made me jump. Every rustle of the wind against the trees sent shivers down my spine. And then the car lurched. Eric cursed, gripping the wheel as the vehicle shuddered and groaned. "What the hell?" The headlights flickered, the engine sputtering before the car rolled to a stop. "No," Eric muttered, twisting the key in the ignition. The engine wheezed but refused to start. "Why are we stopping?" Callie asked, her voice trembling. "The car's dead," Eric said through gritted teeth. A heavy silence settled over us. The forest seemed to lean closer, its shadows deepening. "Do you hear that?" Callie asked suddenly, her head snapping toward the window. We all listened, straining to hear over the blood pounding in our ears. It started faintly, a sound just on the edge of perception. The same melodic hum I'd heard at the campsite, now accompanied by faint, rhythmic drumming. Eric's eyes darted to me in the rearview mirror. "Stay in the car," he said, his tone leaving no room for argument. He and I both knew it was a futile order. Whatever was out there wasn't going to stop for locked doors. The humming grew louder, swelling into a haunting chant that reverberated through the trees. It was hypnotic, like a song sung by voices not meant for this world. "I'm not staying in here," Callie said, her voice tight with panic. I can't breathe." She yanked open the door and bolted. "Callie!" I shouted, scrambling out after her. She was already running, her silhouette disappearing into the trees. Eric was right behind me, flashlight in hand. "Callie, stop," he called, his voice echoing through the forest. The chanting grew louder, seeming to come from every direction. I could feel it vibrating in my chest, worming its way into my mind. We found Callie standing in a small clearing, her back to us. She was motionless, her arms hanging limply at her sides. "Callie?" I approached her cautiously, the hair on the back of my neck prickling. She turned slowly, her face eerily blank. Her eyes, usually so warm and bright, were dull and unfocused. "They're here," she whispered. "Who's here?" Eric asked, stepping forward. Before she could answer, the air around us seemed to shift. The temperature dropped sharply, our breaths puffing out in white clouds. And then they appeared. Figures materialized from the shadows, their forms shimmering like heat waves. There were dozens of them, circling the clearing, their movements unnaturally smooth and fluid. One of them stepped forward, its face partially formed but grotesquely distorted, as if someone had attempted to sculpt a human face from wax and let it melt. "You should not be here," it said, its voice a hollow echo that seemed to vibrate in my skull. Eric stepped in front of me, his stance protective. "We don't mean any harm," he said, his voice steady despite the tremor in his hands. "You disturb the sacred," the figure continued. "This land is not for you." I felt a cold hand brush against my arm and spun around, but there was nothing there. The chanting grew louder, the figures pressing closer. "We'll leave," I said, my voice shaking. "We'll go right now. Please, just let us go." The figures didn't move, their hollow gazes fixed on us. "You have taken what is not yours," the figure said. "You will not leave unmarked." And then the world erupted in light. A blinding white flash consumed the clearing, and I felt a force like a gale wind slam into me. I hit the ground hard, the air knocked from my lungs. When I opened my eyes, the figures were gone. The clearing was empty, save for Eric and me. But Callie was nowhere to be seen. The silence that followed the flash was deafening, as though the entire forest had been plunged into a vacuum. I sat up slowly, my head pounding and my vision swimming. Eric was beside me, his flashlight flickering weakly on the ground. "Callie!" I croaked, scrambling to my feet. My voice echoed into the emptiness, swallowed by the shadows. Eric groaned, clutching his head. "Where is she?" His voice was hoarse, thick with panic. "She was right here," I said, turning in circles. The clearing was empty, devoid of even the faintest trace of Callie, or the spectral figures. Eric grabbed my arm, his grip firm. "We can't stay here. We have to get back to the car." "And leave her?" I snapped, jerking away. "We can't just. She's gone, Sophie." His words were harsh, but his expression betrayed his own terror. "If we stay, we'll be next." I hesitated, my heart warring with my instincts. But the chanting, though now distant, was still there, a haunting reminder of the forces at play. Reluctantly, I nodded, and we began the trek back to the car. The forest was darker now, the trees seeming to lean in closer, their branches clawing at the air. Eric's flashlight sputtered, the beam weak and unsteady. My phone's light was barely better, its glow feeble against the oppressive night. "Just keep moving," Eric muttered, his voice tight. "The car isn't far." But the forest seemed to stretch endlessly, the path twisting and looping in ways that made no sense. "We should have reached the car by now." "Do you hear that?" I asked, my voice trembling. Eric paused, listening. The chanting was louder now, accompanied by a faint rustling sound, like footsteps. "We're being followed," he whispered. I spun around, my light sweeping through the trees. Shadows danced, but nothing moved. And yet, I felt it, a presence, heavy and suffocating, pressing in from all sides. "We need to run," I said, my voice barely more than a breath. Eric nodded, and we took off, our footsteps pounding against the earth. The chanting grew louder, the footsteps faster. My chest burned, my breaths ragged, but I didn't dare slow down. Then, out of nowhere, the ground disappeared beneath me. I tumbled forward, the earth giving way to a steep incline. Eric shouted my name, but his voice was lost as I rolled down the slope, branches and rocks tearing at my skin. When I finally stopped, I lay still for a moment, gasping for air. Pain radiated through my body, but nothing felt broken. "Eric!" I called, my voice echoing. No response. The incline had deposited me in a ravine, its walls towering high on either side. The air was damp and cold, the ground littered with moss-covered stones. I reached for my phone, its screen cracked but still functional. The faint glow illuminated the ravine just enough for me to see the path ahead, or lack thereof. "Eric!" I shouted again, my voice trembling. The chanting was gone now, replaced by a low, rhythmic thumping. It echoed through the ravine, each beat resonating deep in my chest. And then I saw it. A figure stood at the far end of the ravine, its form barely more than a silhouette. It was tall and impossibly thin, its limbs elongated and bent at unnatural angles. "Who's there?" I demanded, though my voice lacked conviction. The figure didn't move. It simply stood there, its head tilted as though observing me. I took a step back, my heart hammering. The figure took a step forward. "Stay back!" I shouted, brandishing my phone like a weapon. The figure paused, its head tilting further. And then it spoke, its voice a rasping whisper that seemed to come from everywhere at once. "You trespass on hallowed ground." I stumbled back, tripping over a rock. "I didn't mean to, we didn't mean to. We're leaving." "You have taken what cannot be returned," the figure said, its voice growing louder. "The debt must be paid. What do you want?" I asked, my voice breaking. The figure raised an arm, its bony finger pointing behind me. I turned, and my blood ran cold. Callie stood there, her face pale and her eyes lifeless. Her clothes were torn, and her skin was streaked with dirt and blood. "Callie?" I whispered, my throat tightening. She didn't respond. She simply stared, her expression blank. "She is ours now," the figure said, its voice reverberating through the ravine. "No!" I shouted, tears streaming down my face. "Take me instead." The figure tilted its head, considering. "The choice is not yours to make." Callie stepped forward, her movements jerky and unnatural. Her mouth opened, but the voice that came out wasn't hers. "Run," she said, her voice echoing with an unnatural distortion. "Run and don't look back." I froze, torn between my instinct to flee and my need to help her. "Run," she screamed, her voice cracking like a whip. The ground beneath me trembled, and I didn't wait to see what was coming. I turned and ran, my legs burning as I scrambled up the incline. The chanting returned, louder than ever, chasing me through the forest. I didn't stop, didn't look back, until I stumbled onto the dirt road and saw the car. Eric was there, leaning against the hood, his face pale and drawn. "Get in," he said, his voice flat. I didn't question him. I climbed into the passenger seat, and he started the engine. This time, it roared to life without hesitation. As we sped away, I looked back one last time. The figures stood at the edge of the forest, their forms glowing faintly in the darkness. Callie was among them, her eyes meeting mine. She smiled, a sad, ghostly smile, before fading into the shadows. We didn't stop driving until the first rays of dawn broke through the horizon, painting the sky in soft hues of gold and pink. The forest had long since given way to open plains, the oppressive shadows replaced by the vast emptiness of the landscape. Eric hadn't said a word since we left. His knuckles were white on the steering wheel, his face a mask of grim determination. I sat curled in the passenger seat, my body trembling despite the warm sunlight streaming through the windows. I glanced at the clock on the dashboard. 6:14 a.m. It felt like an eternity since we'd fled the forest. My thoughts were a tangled mess, images of Callie's lifeless face and the spectral figures flashing through my mind. "Eric," I said softly, breaking the heavy silence. He didn't respond. "Eric," I repeated, louder this time. "What?" His voice was sharp, raw. "Where are we going?" "Away," he said, his eyes fixed on the road. I didn't press further. There was no point. Away wasn't a destination, it was a desperate attempt to escape something we didn't understand. We pulled into a small gas station on the outskirts of a nameless town. The place was deserted, its lone attendant slouched behind the counter, more interested in his phone than his surroundings. Eric stepped out to refuel, leaving me alone in the car. The air outside was crisp, carrying the faint scent of gasoline and dry grass. I reached for my phone, its cracked screen a grim reminder of the night's events. No signal. Of course. I stared out the window, my gaze wandering to the horizon. The landscape was eerily still, the kind of quiet that felt unnatural, like the world was holding its breath. And then I saw it. A figure, standing on the edge of the field, just barely visible in the morning light. It was too far away to make out any details, but its presence sent a chill down my spine. "Eric," I called, my voice trembling. He glanced over, his expression tight. "What is it?" "There's someone out there." I pointed toward the field. He followed my gaze, his brow furrowing. "I don't see anything." I looked again. The figure was gone. "It was there," I insisted, my voice rising. Eric didn't argue, but the look on his face made it clear he thought I was imagining things. He finished refueling and climbed back into the car. "Let's just keep moving," he said, his tone leaving no room for discussion. The miles blurred together, the road stretching endlessly ahead of us. Exhaustion weighed heavily on me, my eyelids drooping despite the fear that clung to my thoughts. I must have dozed off, because the next thing I knew, the car had stopped. Eric was shaking me gently, his face etched with worry. "Sophie, wake up. What's going on?" I asked groggily. "We're out of gas," he said, his voice tight. I blinked, taking in our surroundings. We were on a deserted stretch of road, the landscape barren except for a lone building in the distance. It looked like a motel, its faded sign swaying in the breeze. "There's a station about a mile back," Eric said. "I'll walk there and see if they have a can. You stay here." "No way," I said, my heart pounding. "I'm not staying in this car alone." He hesitated, then nodded. "All right. Let's stick together." We began walking down the road, the motel looming closer with each step. The place was run down, its paint peeling and windows dark. It didn't look like the kind of place anyone would willingly stay, but there was a faint light glowing in the office window. Eric pushed the door open, a small bell jingling overhead. The air inside was stale, the faint smell of mildew clinging to the walls. An older man sat behind the counter, his eyes narrowing as we entered. "Help you folks?" "We ran out of gas," Eric said. "Do you have a spare can?" The man nodded slowly. "Might have one out back." "You wait here, and I'll check." He shuffled away, leaving us alone in the dimly lit room. The walls were lined with faded photographs, most of them depicting the surrounding landscape. But one photo caught my eye. It showed a group of people standing in front of a forest, their faces beaming with excitement. But as I leaned closer, I felt my blood run cold. In the background, just barely visible among the trees, were shadowy figures. "Eric," I whispered, my voice shaking. He turned, his eyes widening as he followed my gaze. "Let's get out of here," he said, grabbing my arm. Before we could move, the old man returned, a rusted gas can in his hands. "Found this out back," he said, setting it on the counter. "Thanks," Eric said quickly, pulling a few bills from his wallet. As we turned to leave, the man's voice stopped us. "You've been to the forest," he said. It wasn't a question. Eric froze, his hand tightening around mine. "Be careful," the man continued, his gaze piercing. "Once you've been marked, they don't let go." We didn't respond. We hurried out the door, the man's warning echoing in my mind. "They don't let go." Back in the car, we drove in silence, the gas can rattling in the trunk. The sun was setting again, the sky painted in fiery hues that mirrored the nightmarish glow of the forest. "Do you think he was right?" I asked finally, breaking the silence. Eric didn't answer immediately. When he did, his voice was low, almost a whisper. "I don't know. But I'm not taking any chances." As the darkness closed in, I felt it again, that suffocating presence, pressing in from all sides. We were miles away from the forest, but it didn't matter. They were still with us. The highway stretched out before us, an unending ribbon of asphalt cutting through the desolate countryside. The sun dipped below the horizon, taking the last shreds of comfort with it. The car's headlights pierced the growing darkness, but they did little to dispel the creeping unease that filled the air. Eric gripped the steering wheel tightly, his jaw set. I sat curled in the passenger seat, my eyes scanning the road and the shadows beyond. It felt as though we were driving in circles, the same stretch of highway repeating over and over. "They don't let go." The old man's words replayed in my mind, a chilling mantra that refused to be ignored. "Eric," I said softly, breaking the silence. "Yeah?" His voice was strained, on edge. "What if we can't outrun them?" He glanced at me, his expression hard. "We don't have a choice. We have to keep moving." I wanted to believe him, but the feeling in my gut told me otherwise. There was no escaping what we'd seen, what we'd disturbed. The car jolted suddenly, and Eric cursed under his breath. "What was that?" I asked, my heart leaping into my throat. "I don't know." He slowed the car, peering out into the darkness. The engine sputtered, then died, plunging us into an oppressive silence. "Not again," Eric muttered, slamming his hands against the steering wheel. "Try it again," I urged, though I already knew it was useless. He twisted the key in the ignition, but the car didn't respond. We sat in the stillness, the only sound the faint rustling of the wind. The headlights flickered and died, leaving us in near total darkness. And then I felt it. The air inside the car grew heavy, pressing down on my chest. My breaths came shallow and quick as a faint humming began, low and melodic, vibrating through my bones. "They're here," I whispered, my voice trembling. Eric grabbed the flashlight from the center console and opened his door. "Don't!" I hissed, grabbing his arm. "We can't just sit here," he said, his voice shaking but resolute. "We have to do something." Reluctantly, I followed him out of the car, the flashlight's beam cutting through the thick darkness. The hum grew louder, accompanied by a faint rustling sound that seemed to come from all around us. "Where's it coming from?" I asked, my voice barely more than a whisper. Eric didn't answer. His flashlight swept over the road, the fields, the car, nothing. And then, slowly, the figures began to emerge. They came from the edges of the darkness, their forms shimmering and translucent. Dozens of them, their faces twisted into masks of sorrow and anger. "Stay behind me," Eric said, his voice low and steady. The figures didn't move closer, but their presence was suffocating. Their hollow gazes bore into us, their forms flickering like dying flames. "What do you want?" Eric demanded, his voice cracking. One of the figures stepped forward, its form more distinct than the others. Its face was a grotesque imitation of humanity, its features warped and distorted. "You took what was sacred," it said, its voice an eerie echo. "We didn't take anything," Eric said, his grip tightening on the flashlight. "We just want to leave." The figure tilted its head, its gaze fixed on Eric. "You carry the mark. You will never leave." "What does that mean?" I asked, my voice trembling. The figure didn't answer. Instead, it raised a hand, pointing toward the car. I turned and gasped. Callie was standing there, her form pale and ghostly. Her eyes met mine, filled with a haunting sorrow. "Callie," I whispered, tears streaming down my face. "Don't fight it," she said, her voice soft but echoing with an unnatural resonance. "It's too late." "No!" I cried, taking a step toward her. Eric grabbed my arm, pulling me back. "It's not her, Sophie. It's not her." Callie's face twisted in anguish, her form flickering. "Please," she whispered. "Let me go." The chanting swelled, the figures pressing closer. Eric pulled me toward the car, his movements frantic. "We need to go," he shouted, yanking open the driver's side door. The car roared to life, its headlights blazing against the darkness. Eric floored the accelerator, the tires screeching as we sped down the road. The figures didn't follow, but their presence lingered, a heavy weight that refused to lift. I looked back, my heart shattering as Callie's form faded into the distance. We drove in silence, the weight of what we'd seen pressing down on us. The landscape around us began to change, the barren fields giving way to familiar roads and towns. For the first time in hours, I felt a flicker of hope. "We're out," Eric said, his voice barely more than a whisper. But as we pulled into the parking lot of a motel, the hope was quickly replaced by dread. The sign above the office was familiar, its letters faded and swaying in the breeze. It was the same motel we'd stopped at earlier. "No," I whispered, my chest tightening. "This can't be right." Eric's face was pale, his hands gripping the steering wheel tightly. The humming began again, faint but unmistakable. "They don't let go," I said, my voice shaking. Eric turned to me, his eyes filled with fear. "What do we do now?" I didn't have an answer. And as the shadows began to shift, the figures emerging once more, I realized the truth. There was no escaping them. The final stretch of road felt interminable, the headlights of the car carving a narrow path through the night. Eric's grip on the wheel had grown so tight his knuckles were nearly translucent. I sat beside him, every muscle in my body coiled with tension. The warning from the old man at the motel looped in my mind like a broken record: once you've been marked, they don't let go. The oppressive presence clung to us, even as we crossed state lines and entered familiar territory. No matter how far we drove, the sensation remained, shadows at the edge of my vision, whispers that seemed to come from nowhere. We reached my apartment just before dawn. The city streets were mercifully empty, the soft glow of streetlights casting fleeting halos on the asphalt. Eric parked and turned off the engine. For a moment, neither of us moved. "Do you think we're safe here?" I asked, breaking the silence. My voice was barely a whisper, as though speaking louder might summon them. Eric's face was grim. "I don't know," he admitted. "But we couldn't keep running forever." Inside the apartment, the normalcy of my living room felt surreal. The worn couch, the familiar hum of the refrigerator, the faint smell of lavender from the air freshener, it all seemed impossibly distant from the horrors we had left behind. Eric locked the door behind us and immediately started closing the blinds. I sank onto the couch, exhaustion washing over me in heavy waves. "We should call someone," I said, though I wasn't sure who. The police? Search and rescue? What could I even tell them? That my best friends had been taken by ancient spirits in the woods? Eric shook his head. And tell them what? They wouldn't believe us. Hell, I barely believe it myself. He sat down beside me, his hand finding mine. We need to figure out what to do next." But before we could say anything else, the lights flickered. I froze, my breath catching in my throat. The flicker came again, more pronounced this time, followed by a low hum that resonated deep in my chest. Eric shot to his feet, his eyes darting around the room. "No," he muttered under his breath. "No, this isn't possible." The hum grew louder, the air around us thickening. Shadows danced on the walls, though nothing in the room was moving. And then I saw her. Callie stood in the corner of the room, her figure pale and translucent, just like the ones we had seen in the forest. Her eyes met mine, and for a fleeting moment, they were filled with a deep, sorrowful regret. "Callie," I whispered, rising unsteadily to my feet. Eric grabbed my arm. "Sophie, don't." But I couldn't stop myself. I took a step toward her, then another. Her lips parted as though she was about to speak, but no sound came out. Behind her, the shadows began to coalesce, forming into shapes, figures. The ones from the forest. Their hollow eyes burned into me, their forms flickering like dying flames. "She's ours now," one of them said, its voice the same hollow echo that had haunted me since that night. "Take me instead," I pleaded, my voice breaking. "Please, just let her go." The figures didn't respond. They began to advance, their movements slow but deliberate. Eric yanked me back, his grip firm. "We need to get out of here." But even as he said it, I knew there was nowhere to go. The walls of the apartment seemed to warp and twist, the shadows spreading like ink. "You can't run," the voice said, reverberating through the room. "You've been marked." The air grew impossibly cold, frost creeping along the windows and walls. My vision blurred, the edges darkening as the hum reached an unbearable crescendo. And then, just as suddenly as it began, it stopped. I opened my eyes to find myself standing in the middle of the forest clearing. The same clearing where we had last seen Callie. Eric was beside me, his expression one of pure disbelief. "We never left," he said, his voice barely audible. The chanting began again, low and melodic, rising with each passing second. Figures emerged from the shadows, their forms flickering like flames in the wind. One stepped forward, its distorted face impossibly close. "The debt is paid." Before I could react, a blinding light consumed the clearing. I felt myself falling, tumbling into a void of cold and silence. When I woke up, I was alone. The forest was gone, replaced by a stark white hospital room. Machines beeped softly around me, their sounds a harsh contrast to the haunting symphony that had chased us through the forest. A nurse appeared, her face kind but concerned. "You're awake," she said gently. "What happened?" I croaked, my throat dry and raw. "You were found near Yellowstone, unconscious," she said. "A search team brought you in. You've been out for days." "Eric?" I asked, my voice trembling. "What about Eric?" Her expression faltered, pity flashing in her eyes. "You were alone when they found you." My heart sank. I sank back against the pillows, my mind racing. Was it over? Had they let me go? As the nurse left the room, I turned my head to look out the window. The sun was setting, casting the sky in hues of amber and crimson. And in the reflection of the glass, I saw them. Figures, pale and flickering, standing at the edge of the room. Watching. Waiting. The debt was never paid,